Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're going to unpack something that is just profoundly universal, yet almost entirely invisible. We're looking at the anatomy of silence. And to be clear, we are not talking about that comfortable, easy silence you share with an old friend. No, we're talking about that heavy, highly deliberate silence that we build around ourselves like a shield. Have you ever found yourself just swallowing your words, not because you had nothing to say, but simply because the emotional cost of actually saying it felt way too high? Well, this explainer is going to trace exactly how and why we stop speaking our truth. We're going to look at the subtle retreat, the hidden costs, and the incredibly heavy burden of carrying around things left unsaid.
There are things I don't say. Not because I can't, but because I've seen what happens when I do. Just let that sink in for a second. We aren't talking about an inability to articulate a thought here. This is absolutely a learned behavior. It's a quiet, heavy realization that's born purely from experience. It's that invisible burden of knowing your honesty has a price tag attached to it, a price you're just no longer willing to pay.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think about it. We are taught from a very young age that communication is the key to everything, right? Just talk it out. Just express how you feel. But the painful initial realization that kicks off this entire cycle of silence is that speaking doesn't actually always clear things up. In fact, if you're speaking to the wrong person, offering up your vulnerability just gives them more material to twist. When you try to genuinely explain your heart and it just gets taken out of context, or worse, used against you later, a very fundamental shift happens inside of you. You realize that your words aren't a bridge to understanding at all. They're ammunition.
So what do? You stop. But, and this is important, it doesn't happen suddenly. It's not some dramatic, cinematic moment where you vow to never speak again. It is a slow, gradual retreat. First, you just start cutting your sentences a bit shorter. You offer exactly enough information to participate, but nowhere near enough to be truly seen. Then, you start leaving things unfinished. You just kind of trail off. And finally, you reach the point where you just let people assume whatever they want to assume. Why? Because the sheer emotional labor of correcting them, of trying to make them see the real you, feels infinitely heavier than simply staying silent and fading into the background.
Now, what's really interesting, and honestly quite painful about this retreat, is the massive disconnect between the outside world and your internal reality. Like, what do people actually see when you go quiet? They see agreement. They think you're at peace. They might even applaud your maturity for not arguing. But what is actually happening behind the scenes? You are actively holding everything back. You are gripping the steering wheel so tightly, metaphorically speaking, just to avoid turning a simple interaction into something incredibly emotionally draining. They think you're totally fine with the situation, but in reality, you've just decided that engaging simply isn't worth the exhaustion.
And oh man, here is where the overthinking trap catches you. You don't react the way people expect, not because you don't feel things, but because you feel them entirely too much. You know for a fact that if you speak while you're in the thick of that emotion, it won't come out perfectly. So you use a delay tactic. You wait. You let it sit. You replay the conversation in your head over and over and over again, waiting for those intense feelings to pass so you don't say it wrong. But the tragedy here is, by the time you've actually processed it all and you finally feel calm enough to speak, it just feels completely useless, because now the moment has passed, and bringing it back up, that's just another exhausting hurdle.
This whole retreat isn't built on massive betrayals, It is constructed from tiny, almost imperceptible moments. So how does this silence actually build? Well, it's a tone that just felt slightly off when someone greeted you. It's a passing sentence from a friend that stayed in your head way longer than it should have, just echoing with hidden meaning. It's a fleeting look across a room that communicated volumes more than their actual words ever did. These are things that literally no one else in the room even noticed, but you did. And once you start noticing these tiny fractures in how people treat your vulnerability, you absolutely cannot unnotice them. Because of those small moments, you become highly, highly observant. You basically start running a quiet audit on your social circles, like a very tired, emotional IRS. You start paying deep attention to who actually listens to understand you versus who is merely waiting for their turn to speak. You notice who says, "Hey, you can tell me anything," but completely shuts down or dismisses you the absolute second you actually do. And after a while of putting your truth out there and just watching it fall flat, a profound shift happens. You stop testing people. You stop reaching out to see if there is a safe space for your honesty, simply because you are so tired of being disappointed.
It's safer to be half understood than fully seen and then misunderstood. Just let the emotional weight of that truth wash over you for a second. It is such a heartbreaking compromise. You willingly choose to live in a state where people only know a fraction of who you are. because giving them the full picture, showing them your entire heart, only to have them misinterpret it, judge it, or reject it, that is a pain that cuts way too deep to risk a second time.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is this. You aren't actually becoming a quiet person. We need to scratch that label. You are becoming a careful person. Your silence is a highly calibrated defense mechanism. Now, you think before every single sentence. You aren't just thinking about what you're saying, you are mapping out all the possible trajectories of those words. How might this be taken? How might this be repeated to someone else later? How might this come back to bite me in a completely different form? This level of hyper-awareness is utterly exhausting, for sure, but it feels deeply necessary to protect yourself from past hurt.
You start to recognize the sheer futility of trying to change certain minds, as this quote captures just perfectly. Explaining yourself to someone who already decided who you are feels like talking to a wall that answers back. It is a gentle, deep exhaustion. I mean, why spend your precious energy, your literal soul, trying to translate your intentions to someone who is fully committed to misunderstanding you? You learn pretty quickly that some people have placed you in a very specific box in their minds, and literally no amount of heartfelt explanation is going to change their preconceived narrative. So you just save your breath.
And that brings us to a kind of strange paradox. The world might view you as closed off or guarded or distant, but you know the actual truth. You aren't closed off at all. Your true, vibrant, incredibly complex self is fully intact. You are just highly, highly selective. You give people the version of you that is easy for them to handle. You know, the calm one, the uncomplicated one. But the most important parts, the parts that actually define your soul, you keep those safely inside. You only share them if you are absolutely certain someone knows how to truly hold them.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because this incredibly selective protective mechanism definitely has a shadow side. There is a massive unseen cost here. The psychological toll of suppressing so much emotion, so many complex thoughts over such a long period of time is immense. When you keep too much in, it doesn't just magically evaporate. It doesn't disappear just because you refuse to speak it aloud. It stays. It sits quietly in the background of your mind, just accumulating mass, until one day, something incredibly small touches it.
And suddenly, you feel entirely more than the present moment deserves. You lash out, or maybe you break down in tears over some minor inconvenience, and you just hate yourself for it because you look erratic. But listen to me, you aren't overreacting to the present moment. You are reacting to absolutely everything that came before it. You are reacting to the massive backlog of 100 different conversations where you bit your tongue. You are carrying the weight of everything you never allowed yourself to say, and it is finally, inevitably, spilling over.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core of this entire experience. People think silence is empty. It's not. It's full of things that were never given the right place to exist. Just let that sentiment linger for a second. The space around you isn't some empty void. It is a crowded, heavy room of unspoken truths, swallowed boundaries, and totally hidden feeling.
Because you don't even try to find a place for those thoughts anymore. You just carry them. And carrying them simply becomes your new normal. But that weight has to manifest somehow, right? It leaks out in your daily life. It shows up in the way you physically hesitate before answering a simple question. It shows up in the way you suddenly change your words mid-sentence because you sense the other person pulling away. And it absolutely shows up in that knee-jerk reflex of saying, "Oh, it's fine," with a tight smile, when the reality is, it's not even close to fine.
Which brings us to the tragic endpoint of this cycle. The most dangerous part isn't even what other people think of you. The most dangerous part is what you end up doing to yourself. You get so incredibly used to holding things in that the very idea of fully saying what's on your mind starts to feel unnatural. It starts to feel almost wrong. You literally start gaslighting yourself. You tell yourself, well, maybe it's not that serious. Maybe I'm just overthinking it again. It's better to just leave it alone. And just like that, you convince yourself to stay quiet.
So another profound thought stays right where it always goes, completely unsaid. Not because it didn't matter, but because you made the quiet, heartbreaking decision that no one really needed to hear it. Which leaves us with one final deeply intimate thought to reflect on as we wrap up today. When you constantly decide that the world just isn't safe for your honesty, where do all those unsaid words actually go?